Banished by her brothers, she took refuge in a rusted train boiler. Orrin Halverson, who had survived 11 Minnesota winters and buried a wife to the cold, told her, "You'll die inside it like a rat in a tin can." She had $4, no family, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 71 degrees in 12 hours. But 5 months earlier, Sigrid Moen had never spent a single night outdoors in winter in her life. She had arrived in Yellow Medicine County 5 years earlier, in the summer of 1882, standing on the deck of a steamboat that pushed its way up the Minnesota River. Sigrid Moen was 18 years old. Her father Halvor stood beside her, pointing to the bluffs rising from the water. Her mother Ingrid gripped the railing with white knuckles, now already regretting the crossing from Trondheim. Her brothers Eric and Lars had been arguing about land claims since before the boat left St. Paul. The family homesteaded 160 acres near Granite Falls. "Good land," Halvor said, "black soil that would grow anything, timber enough to build with, a creek for water. They would prosper here." For 4 years they did. Halvor cleared 40 acres with his sons. They built a cabin of chinked logs, 4 rooms tight against the wind. They raised chickens, then pigs, then 2 dairy cows. Sigrid learned to make cheese that sold in Granite Falls for 12 cents a pound. Her mother's egg money accumulated in a tin box hidden beneath the floorboards. Then Halvor died. It happened in March of 1886, 3 days after a late blizzard. He had gone to check on a cow that was calving. The temperature had risen to 34 degrees, warm enough that he left his heavy coat inside. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped back to 6 below. They found him the next morning in the barn, still alive, but barely. His lungs had filled with fluid. Pneumonia, the doctor in Granite Falls said. Nothing to be done. Halvor Moen was buried on March 17th, 1886, in the small Norwegian cemetery 3 miles from the homestead. He was 52 years old. Ingrid Moen followed her husband 7 months later. The doctor said it was her heart. But Sigrid knew better. Her mother had simply stopped wanting to live. She ate less and less. She stopped tending the chickens she had raised from chicks. She sat by the window, looking at nothing. Beyond till one October morning, she did not wake up. The homestead, the cabin, the barn, the 40 cleared acres, the animals, the equipment, the land itself was to be divided equally among the 3 children. This had been Halvor's explicit wish, stated many times, witnessed by neighbors. But Halvor Moen had never written a will. Under Minnesota territorial law, property without a will passed to male heirs. Eric Moen, the eldest at 28, informed Sigrid of this fact in August of 1887. He and Lars had consulted a lawyer in Granite Falls. The law was clear. As an unmarried woman, Sigrid had no legal standing to inherit. The conversation took place in the cabin Sigrid had helped build, at the table her mother had scrubbed every morning for 4 years. "Father wanted me to have a third," Sigrid said. "You both know that." "What Father wanted doesn't matter," Eric replied. "What the law says matters. And the law says this land belongs to Lars and me." Lars, the younger brother at 26, said nothing. He stared at the table. "I helped clear that land," Sigrid said. "I've worked here for 5 years. I made cheese. I sold eggs. I built this place as much as either of you." "You're a woman," Eric said. "Women don't own property. That's how the law works. But we're not putting you out on the road. We have a solution." The solution was Gunnar Dahl. Dahl was a widower, 47 years old, who farmed 80 acres 12 miles south. His first wife had died in childbirth. His second wife had left him after 2 years, an almost unheard of scandal in the Norwegian community. The rumors said he drank. The rumors said he had a temper. The rumors said his second wife had left with bruises visible on her face and arms. Gunnar has agreed to take you, Eric said. He needs a wife. You need a home. It's a practical arrangement. Gunnar Dahl beats his wives, Sigrid said. Gunnar Dahl has agreed to pay us $40 for the introduction, Eric said, which we're prepared to split with you. You'll have $20 to start your married life. That's more than most women get. Sigrid looked at Lars. Her younger brother would not meet her eyes. No, Sigrid said. Eric's expression did not change. Then you have until sundown to gather your things, whatever you can carry. After that, you're trespassing on our property, and I'll have you removed. She expected Lars to protest. He had been the gentler brother as a child, the one who brought her wildflowers, who let her ride on his shoulders. But Lars said nothing. He continued to stare at the table as if the wood grain contained answers to questions no one had asked. Sigrid stood. Mother always said you were the cruel one, Eric. Father said you'd grow out of it. They were both wrong. You were cruel as a child, and you're cruel now. The only thing that's changed is that now you have the law behind you. Sundown, Eric said. Take whatever fits in your arms. She left at 4 in the afternoon on August 23rd, 1887, with the summer sun still high and hot. She carried a canvas sack containing $4 in coins, her share of the egg money, which she had hidden separately from her mother's savings, one wool blanket woven by her mother in Norway, her mother's cook stove. The cook stove was the only thing Eric had not wanted. It was small, designed for a Norwegian fishing cottage, not a frontier cabin, and its firebox had cracked during the passage from Trondheim. It burned unevenly. The Moen brothers had bought a larger American stove 3 years ago and relegated the old one to the barn, where it had rusted. Sigrid took it anyway. The stove weighed 43 pounds. It cut into her shoulder as she walked, but it was her mother's, and she would not leave it behind. She walked east, away from the homestead, because walking west would take her past the Lindquist farm, and she did not want anyone to see her. Not yet, not until she knew where she was going. She had no plan. She had $4, a blanket, and a cracked stove. She had no family in America besides the brothers who had just thrown her out. Nor she had no skills beyond farm work, cheese making, and the basic reading and arithmetic her mother had taught her. She had never spent a night outdoors in her life. The first night, she slept in a thicket of scrub oak, wrapped in the blanket, the stove beside her like a strange iron companion. Mosquitoes found her within minutes. By dawn, her arms and face were swollen with bites. The second day, she walked without direction. The landscape was flat enough that she could see for miles, grassland interrupted by scattered trees, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. She avoided the farmhouses. She did not want charity. She did not want pity. She wanted something she could not name. In the late afternoon, she descended into a ravine the locals called Skull Gulch. A creek ran through the bottom, mostly dry in August. But the walls rose perhaps 30 feet on either side, steep but not cliffs, covered in brush and stunted oaks. It was cooler down here, shaded from the sun. That was when she saw the boiler. It sat at the base of the ravine's eastern wall, half buried in 6 years of accumulated brush and debris, 18 feet long, 6 feet in diameter, a cylinder of rusted iron that looked like the skeleton of some enormous beast. Sigrid knew what it was immediately. In 1881, a Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul freight locomotive had jumped the tracks 2 miles east of here during a spring flood. The railroad had salvaged the engine, the wheels, the cab, everything of value. But the boiler, the massive iron drum where water had been heated to steam, was too heavy and too remote. They had cut it free from the locomotive and left it where it fell, The open end where the firebox had been cut away faced west toward the creek. The closed end rested against the ravine wall. The iron was orange with rust, but the rust was surface corrosion only. The metal beneath remained solid. Sigrid set down her sack and her stove. She approached the open end of the boiler and peered inside. The interior was dark, cool, and filled with debris. She could see dried leaves, rodent nests, the shapes of things she could not identify in the shadows. The air smelled of rust and old animal musk. She crawled inside. The iron was cool against her palms, noticeably cooler than the August air outside. The curved walls rose around her, blocking the sun entirely. She crawled deeper, pushing through drifts of dried leaves, until she reached the sealed end. Then she turned around and sat with her back against the iron. From here she could see the opening 18 feet away, a circle of brightness against the dim interior. The curved ceiling arched above her. The space was tight, but not cramped. If she lay down, she could stretch out almost fully. If she sat up, her head cleared the ceiling by a foot. She sat there for a long time, thinking. The iron walls were thick, 3/4 of an inch at least, probably more. Solid iron, no gaps, no seams, no places where wind could enter. The railroad had built locomotive boilers to contain pressurized steam. They built them to withstand forces that would tear apart ordinary metal. Wind could not pass through this. Cold could not pass through this. Not easily. She thought about her father explaining Norwegian sod houses to Eric and Lars when they were children. The earth holds heat, Halvor had said. The thick walls absorb warmth during the day and release it slowly at night. That is why our ancestors survived winters that killed others. Iron was not earth, but iron was thick. Iron was solid. Iron conducted heat. She knew this from watching her mother cook. An iron pan heated evenly. The entire surface became hot, not just the part over the flame. If iron conducted heat, then iron would hold heat. She crawled back out into the August afternoon and stood looking at the boiler for a long time. The opening at the western end was approximately 4 feet in diameter, where the firebox had been cut away. That opening would need to be sealed. But sealing it was a problem of carpentry, not engineering. Her father had taught her basic carpentry. She had helped build the cabin's door. The valve hole at the eastern end, at the top of the sealed portion, was perhaps 4 inches in diameter. A stovepipe could exit through that hole if the hole was widened. She would need fuel. She had no axe to fell trees, but there was deadfall everywhere in the ravine, and the remains of abandoned homesteads dotted Yellow Medicine County like bones. Fence rails, collapsed barn boards, the wooden detritus of failed dreams. She would need supplies to build a door. She had $4. The space inside was perhaps 500 cubic feet. The cabin she had helped build was over 1,400 cubic feet, and it required 4 cords of firewood to heat through a Minnesota winter. This space was barely a third that size, when it would require proportionally less fuel, perhaps less than 2 cords if she was careful. Sigrid looked at the rusted iron cylinder sitting in the ravine, abandoned and forgotten, and she began to see something that no one else would see. She saw a home. 3 days later, Orrin Halverson found her. Halverson was a Norwegian bachelor farmer who worked 120 acres 3 miles north of Skol Gulch. He was 56 years old, with a face weathered to leather and hands that looked like they had been carved from oak. He walked with a limp, the legacy of a horse kick in '79, and he spoke rarely, even among the taciturn Norwegians of Yellow Medicine County. He had survived 11 Minnesota winters. In the blizzard of 1873, he had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite, the middle and ring fingers, as he had taken at the first knuckle. In the hard winter of 1880, His first wife had developed a cough that settled into her lungs and did not leave. He had buried her in March of that year, in the same Norwegian cemetery where Halvor Moen now rested. Halvorsen knew what winter could do. He had seen it kill men stronger than him. He had held his wife's hand as she drowned in fluid her own lungs produced. He had heard about the Moen brothers sending their sister away. The Norwegian community was small. News traveled fast. He had also heard that Sigrid had been seen in Skoll Gulch near the old boiler wreck. He came to see for himself. He found Sigrid on her hands and knees inside the boiler, scraping at the interior with a piece of bent metal. A pile of debris sat outside the opening, dried leaves, rust flakes, which what looked like rodent bones. "Miss Moen," he said. Sigrid started. She had not heard him approach. She crawled backward out of the boiler and stood, brushing rust dust from her dress. Her hands were raw and bloody from the scraping. "Mr. Halverson," she said. Halverson looked at the boiler. He looked at the pile of debris. He looked at the small cook stove sitting nearby, its cracked firebox visible. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Cleaning it out." "I can see that. Why?" Sigrid hesitated. She had not spoken her plan aloud to anyone, saying it would make it real, saying it would invite judgment. "I'm going to live in it," she said. Halverson's expression did not change. He walked around the boiler slowly, examining it from all sides. He touched the rusted iron. He peered into the open end. He looked at the valve hole at the top rear. Then he turned back to Sigrid. "You'll die?" he said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected skepticism. She had not expected flat certainty. "Why?" she asked. "That iron will turn on you when the cold comes." "Iron conducts. Put your hand on an iron pan in winter. It's colder than the air. That boiler will freeze solid by November. The cold will radiate inward the same way heat radiates outward. You'll think the walls are holding heat, and they'll be stealing it instead." He gestured at the cracked cook stove. "And that thing won't produce enough heat to fight it, not with a damaged firebox." "I'll seal the opening," Sigrid said. "I'll make it airtight. The wind won't." "The wind isn't what kills people," Halverson interrupted. "The cold kills people. Tick, the cold doesn't need wind. The cold just needs time. And you'll have plenty of time lying in this iron drum, waiting for the temperature to drop. You'll feel it start to work. You'll feel the heat draining out of your body into those walls. And by the time you realize you're dying, you won't have the strength to climb out." Sigrid said nothing. "I've seen people die of cold, Miss Moen. I held my wife while she died of what the cold did to her lungs. I know what winter does. And I'm telling you that rusted drum will freeze solid and you'll die inside it like a rat in a tin can." He paused. His eyes were not unkind, but they held no compromise. "And no one will find you until spring thaw." "What would you have me do?" Sigrid asked. "Go back to my brothers? Marry Gunnar Dahl?" "I would have you build a proper cabin, or find someone who will take you in." "I have $4, Mr. Halverson. A cabin costs $35 in materials alone, even if I build it myself. And I have no tools, no axe, no saw, no hammer. I have $4 and a cracked stove and 8 weeks until the first hard freeze. Then you should find another solution, because this one will kill you." Halverson turned and began walking back up the ravine. He paused at the top and looked back down at her. "I buried my wife," he said. "I don't want to bury you, too. Not like this. Not because you were too stubborn to see the truth." Then he was gone. Sigrid sat beside the boiler for a long time after Halverson left. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. The shadows in the ravine were lengthening. The temperature had begun to fall, not dramatically, not dangerously, but noticeably. The August heat was fading. In 8 weeks, the first hard freeze would arrive. In 16 weeks, deep winter would begin. She had $4. She had no axe, no saw, no hammer. She had a cracked cook stove that burned unevenly. She had never spent a single night outdoors in winter in her life. And she had this boiler. Halverson's words echoed in her mind. Iron conducts. The cold will radiate inward. You'll die like a rat in a tin can. He was right about the physics. Iron did conduct. She had felt cold iron in winter, the bite of it, the way it seemed to pull heat from her skin. But she had also felt something else inside the boiler, something Halverson had not noticed because he had been looking from the outside. She crawled back into the boiler and sat at the far end, her back against the sealed iron. The interior was dark now, lit only by the fading light from the entrance. The air was cool, noticeably cooler than outside, where the August afternoon still held warmth. The iron was absorbing the day's heat. It was taking warmth from the air and storing it in its mass. By morning, the iron would be cooler than the air outside, but not much cooler because the air would have cooled during the night too. What if she reversed the process? What if she heated the iron deliberately, with a fire, with the stove, and let the iron store that heat? The walls were 3/4 of an inch thick. They surrounded her on all sides. They would absorb heat from the stove and release it slowly, evenly, throughout the entire cylindrical space. In a cabin, heat rose to the ceiling and stayed there. The floor was always cold. The corners were always cold. Heat escaped through gaps in the chinking, through the roof, through every seam where wood met wood. In a cylinder, there were no corners. Heat could not rise to a peak because there was no peak. The curved walls would distribute warmth evenly, the way a curved pan distributed heat evenly over a cooking surface. And the iron, the solid, unbroken iron, would let nothing through. Not wind, not drafts, not the subtle leaking of warmth that plagued every log cabin ever built. Halverson thought the iron would conduct cold inward. Sigrid thought the iron would trap heat inside. One of them was wrong. She sat in the darkness, calculating. The boiler was 18 feet long and 6 feet in diameter. That meant approximately 500 cubic feet of interior space. Or the cabin she had helped build was 16 by 12 by 8, over 1,500 cubic feet. The boiler was less than a third the size. A third the size meant a third the fuel to heat. Possibly less, if the walls truly held heat the way she imagined. 4 cords of wood heated the Moen cabin through winter. 1.5 cords, maybe 2, might heat this space. And unlike a cabin, she could scavenge fuel rather than cut it. Deadfall, fence rails, collapsed barns. The wood was out there, already down, waiting to be gathered. The mathematics were different here. The physics were different. The rules that Halverson had learned through 11 winters of cabin dwelling might not apply. Or they might apply exactly as he said, and she would die. There was only one way to know. Over the next 2 days, Sigrid developed her plan. First, so she needed to clear the interior of the boiler. 6 years of debris had accumulated: leaves, rust flakes, animal nests, the remains of creatures that had sought shelter and died. All of it had to come out. Second, she needed to build a door. The opening where the firebox had been cut away was approximately 4 feet in diameter. A wooden door, 3 inches thick, framed tight and sealed with pine pitch, would close that opening. The door would hinge inward, allowing her to enter and exit while minimizing heat loss. Third, she needed to adapt the valve hole for a stovepipe. The hole was 4 inches in diameter. Standard stovepipe required 6 inches. She would need to widen it, which meant she would need a file or some tool capable of cutting through iron. Fourth, she needed to position the cook stove near the sealed eastern end, mine with its pipe exiting through the widened valve hole. The cracked firebox was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. The crack meant uneven burning and some heat loss, but some heat was better than no heat. Fifth, she needed fuel, at least 2 cords, probably more to be safe. Without an axe, she could not fell trees. She would have to scavenge, deadfall, abandoned structures, whatever she could find and haul. Sixth, she needed to solve the condensation problem. She had noticed moisture beading on the iron walls even in August, when the temperature difference between inside and outside was minimal. In winter, with a hot stove and freezing exterior, the condensation would be severe. Water would drip from the ceiling. Ice might form on the walls. She needed some way to manage the moisture. 6 problems. $4. 8 weeks. She had no margin for error. On the morning of August 29th, Sigrid began clearing the boiler's interior. She had fashioned a scraper from a piece of the boiler's own plating, a section that had broken away near the firebox cut, probably when the railroad salvaged the rest of the locomotive. She bent it into a curved blade using rocks as hammers and her own weight as leverage. The edge was dull, but it would push debris. The work was brutal. She entered the boiler on hands and knees, pushing into darkness. The air was thick with rust dust that coated her throat and made her cough. The debris shifted under her weight, unpredictable, sometimes solid, sometimes collapsing into hollows where animals had nested. 3 feet in, she found the first rat nest, a mass of shredded leaves and fur and old grass, packed tight against the lower curve of the cylinder. She scraped it loose and pushed it behind her toward the entrance. 6 feet in, she found bones. A full skeleton of something, a raccoon, she thought, based on the skull shape. It had crawled into the boiler to die years ago and had slowly mummified in the dry darkness. She pushed the bones out with the rest. 9 feet in, the debris became dense. Rust flakes had fallen from the ceiling over years, mixing with leaves and dirt, blown in by wind. The layer was nearly a foot thick in places, packed hard. She had to dig at it with the scraper, breaking it loose in chunks that scattered more rust dust into the air. Her hands blistered on the first day. The blisters broke on the second day, leaving raw skin that bled when she gripped the scraper. By the third day, calluses had begun to form, hard ridges across her palms that would thicken into permanent marks. Her knees turned purple from crawling on iron. The metal was not sharp, but it was unforgiving. Bruises spread across both kneecaps, then merged into a single mass of discolored flesh that ached constantly. She coughed rust dust for hours after each work session. At night, she spat, and the spit was orange. But she made progress. By September 1st, she had cleared the first 6 feet. By September 4th, she had cleared 12 feet. By September 8th, she had cleared the entire interior, 18 feet of cylinder, scraped clean of debris, the iron walls exposed and gleaming dull red in what light reached the far end. She had hauled out 14 loads of debris. Was each one requiring her to crawl backward 18 feet while pushing a mass of rotted material ahead of her? Each load left her coated in filth, her dress stained beyond recovery, her hair matted with dust and fragments of old nests. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dress hung looser. Her cheekbones had begun to show. She had been perhaps 115 pounds when her brothers threw her out. She was perhaps 105 now, possibly less. But the boiler was clean. On September 9th, Martha Lindquist found her. Martha was a farm wife who lived 2 miles south of Skull Gulch. On a 100-acre spread, she worked with her husband Arnie and their 5 surviving children. She was 42 years old, built solid from decades of farm work, with gray streaking her brown hair, and a face that had learned to express disapproval without moving. She had raised 5 children through Minnesota winters, 5 who survived, 2 who did not. She knew what winter demanded: preparation, resources, ruthless practicality. She had no patience for dreams that ignored arithmetic. She had heard about the Moen girl living in the ravine. She had heard about the boiler. She had come to see for herself and to offer an alternative. Sigrid was hauling water from the creek when Martha appeared at the rim of the ravine. "Miss Moen," Martha called down. Sigrid looked up. She set down the bucket and wiped her hands on her dress, a pointless gesture since both the hands and the dress were already filthy. "Mrs. Lindquist." Martha descended the slope carefully, picking her way through the brush. She reached the bottom and looked at the boiler, at the pile of debris, at Sigrid's raw hands and gaunt frame. "They told me you were living in this thing," Martha said. "I didn't believe it. I'm not living in it yet. I'm preparing it." "Preparing it for what? To be your coffin?" The word hit harder than Martha probably intended. Eric had called it that too. Iron coffin. The phrase was spreading. "To be my home," Sigrid said. Martha walked around the boiler, examining it with the practical eye of a woman who had built and maintained structures her entire adult life. She touched the iron, peered into the opening, looked at the cleared interior. "Iron sweats in cold weather," she said. "You know that, don't you? The moisture in the air condenses on cold surfaces. In winter, with a fire inside and freezing air outside, these walls will drip constantly. You'll be living in an ice box that drips on you when you finally get it warm." "I know," Sigrid said. "I'm working on a solution." "And the rust," Martha continued. "Look at it. The whole interior is orange with it. You'll be breathing rust dust all winter. It gets in your lungs. It doesn't come out. By March, your lungs will be failing, even if you don't freeze first." "I scraped most of it loose. I'll brush down the walls before winter." "You'll brush down iron walls that you can't reach without crawling through the space you're brushing. The dust will settle on everything, on your food, on your bedding, on your face while you sleep." Martha shook her head. "Every railroad man knows boilers are for boiling water, not for living. This thing wasn't built for people. It was built to contain steam pressure. The walls are too thick to heat quickly. The space is too cramped for comfort. The shape is wrong for—" "The shape is perfect," Sigrid interrupted. Martha stopped. "Heat rises in a cabin," Sigrid said. "It goes to the ceiling and stays there while the floor freezes. In a cylinder, there is no ceiling. The heat curves along the walls. It distributes evenly. Every surface becomes a heating surface." "That's theory. Have you tested it?" "Not yet. I've only just finished clearing it out." "So you're gambling your life on theory?" "I'm gambling my life on observation and arithmetic," Sigrid said. "The same things my father used when he built the cabin you sleep in every night. The same things every homesteader uses. I'm just using different materials." Martha was silent for a moment, and then she said, "I came here to offer you work." Sigrid waited. "Arna and I need help with the slaughtering this fall. 2 hogs, 4 sheep, and a steer. It's too much for our family alone. I can offer you room and board through the winter in exchange for labor. A corner of the root cellar, warm and dry. Meals with the family. It's not charity. You'd be earning your keep." Sigrid looked at the boiler. Then she looked at Martha. The offer was genuine. She could see that. Martha was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one, offering a practical solution. But the root cellar meant dependence. It meant living in someone else's home, eating someone else's food, following someone else's rules. It meant she would own nothing, control nothing, have standing in nothing. She would be a servant in all but name, grateful for the corner she was given, unable to leave, unable to refuse whatever demands came next. And when spring came, she would have nothing. No home, no savings, no path forward except to find another family to take her in, another corner to sleep in, another year of dependence followed by another. The boiler might kill her, but the root cellar would erase her. "Thank you," Sigrid said. "But no." Martha's face tightened. "You're choosing possible death over certain safety." "I'm choosing possible independence over certain servitude." "That's pride talking. Pride will kill you out here faster than cold." "Maybe. But I'll be alive until it does. And if I survive the winter, I'll have something that's mine. That matters to me." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Something flickered in her expression, frustration perhaps, or something closer to respect. "You'll need tools," Martha said finally, "to build that door." "I have $4. I was going to buy what I need in Granite Falls. I have tools you can borrow: hammer, saw, hand plane. Bring them back when you're done, and don't break them." Sigrid stared at her. "You just told me this was going to kill me." "I told you what I think. That doesn't mean I won't help you try." Martha turned to leave. "Come by tomorrow morning. I'll have the tools ready. And Sigrid," she stopped, "if you change your mind about the cellar, the offer stands until first snow. After that, we won't have room." Then she climbed back up the ravine and was gone. The next morning, Sigrid walked 2 miles south to the Lindquist farm. Martha gave her the tools without ceremony: a carpenter's hammer, a crosscut saw, a hand plane. All well used, all well maintained. 1 month, Martha said. "Then I need them back." 1 month, Sigrid agreed. She walked back to the ravine with the tools over her shoulder, her mind already calculating. September 10th. 1 month meant October 10th. The first hard freeze typically arrived in early October, sometimes later, sometimes earlier. She needed the door finished before the cold came. Her $4 would buy rough-cut lumber scraps from the Granite Falls mill, maybe $1.50 hinges. Salvaged iron hinges from a dismantled wagon would be cheaper than new ones. Maybe 60 cents pine pitch for ceiling, 40 cents at most nails. She could buy bent nails from the smith for half the price of new ones. Maybe 80 cents. That left her with 70 cents. Not enough for anything else, but she might not need anything else if she was careful. She walked to Granite Falls that afternoon, 7 miles each way. The town was small but busy. A collection of wood frame buildings clustered around the river crossing. She found the sawmill first. "Scraps," she told the mill owner, a German named Hoffman who had the arms of a man who lifted lumber all day. "The pieces you'd burn." "I don't need pretty, I need thick." Hoffman looked at her. Young woman, dirty dress, raw hands, alone. "What are you building?" "A door." "What kind of door needs scrap lumber?" "A thick one." Hoffman scratched his jaw. "I've got offcuts from a beam order, 3-inch thick. Too short for any regular use. But if you're piecing something together..." He named a price, $1.20. She paid. The hinges came from a wagon maker who was dismantling a freight wagon that had been abandoned after a wheel broke. 60 cents for 2 iron hinges, each 6 inches long, still solid despite surface rust. The pine pitch came from a general store, 40 cents for a small pot. The nails came from the blacksmith, 80 cents for 10 pounds of bent nails, most of them pulled from demolished structures and straightened badly. She walked back to the ravine with her purchases in a sack, reaching Skull Gulch just before dark. She had spent $3.04. She had 96 cents remaining. Not enough for food. Not enough for anything except what she had already bought. From now on, she would have to scavenge everything. The Eric Moen came to the ravine on September 14th. Sigrid was laying out the lumber for the door, measuring and marking cuts with a piece of charcoal. She heard footsteps above and looked up to see her brother standing at the rim of the gulch, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. He descended without waiting for invitation. He walked past her without acknowledgement and went directly to the boiler. He touched the rusted iron. He peered into the opening. He looked at the cook stove, the lumber, the tools. Then he turned to face her. "So it's true," he said. "You're actually going to live in this thing." Sigrid continued marking her lumber. "I don't remember inviting you here." "I don't need an invitation. This isn't your land either." "It isn't anyone's land. It's a ravine. No one filed on it because no one wanted it. Someone will file on it eventually. What will you do then?" "I'll deal with that when it happens. What do you want, Eric?" Eric walked closer. He was 28 years old, tall like their father had been, with the same broad shoulders and strong jaw. But where their father's face had been kind, Eric's had hardened into something sharper, something calculating. "I want to understand," he said. "I gave you a choice, a good choice. Gunnar Dahl is a prosperous man. He would have taken care of you. Gunnar Dahl would have beaten me. Everyone knows what happened to his second wife. Rumors, gossip. She was a difficult woman. She left with bruises on her face, Eric. That's not rumor. Mrs. Anderson saw her at the road. Both eyes blackened. And that's worse than this?" Eric gestured at the ravine, the boiler, the crude camp she had made. "You'd rather die in a ditch than live in a farmhouse?" "I'd rather die in a ditch than be beaten by a drunk." Sigrid set down her charcoal and stood. "But I'm not going to die, Eric. I'm going to survive the winter, and then I'm going to watch you explain to every Norwegian in Yellow Medicine County how you threw your sister out, and she did better without you than you ever expected." Eric's expression shifted. There it was, the thing she had suspected. He wasn't here out of concern. He was here because her survival would embarrass him. "You're living in a coffin, Sigrid," he said. "An iron coffin. When they find your body frozen inside this thing, people will say I did you a kindness. At least you'll already be in your burial box." "Then you should hope it works," Sigrid replied. "If I die, the Norwegians will remember who put me here." "I put you nowhere. You refused Gunnar Dahl. You chose this." "I chose not to be beaten by a drunk. The law may say you own our parents' land. The law says nothing about my right to survive." "Father always said you were stubborn like a mule." "Father also said the land was mine equally. You knew what he wanted. You both knew." Eric's face hardened further. "Father is dead. What he wanted doesn't matter. What the law says matters, and the law says Lars and I own that land. We offered you a fair alternative. You refused. What happens to you now is your own choice." "Yes," Sigrid said, "it is my choice. That's the first true thing you've said." Eric stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and began climbing out of the ravine. "Iron coffin," he called back over his shoulder. "That's what everyone's calling it now. Iron coffin. When you freeze to death in there, at least we won't have to build you a box." Sigrid watched him go. Her hands were shaking, with anger, with fear, with something she could not name. Iron coffin. The phrase would spread. She knew it. Eric would make sure it spread. By the time winter came, everyone in Yellow Medicine County would know what he called it. Everyone would be watching to see if she died. She picked up her charcoal and returned to marking the lumber. If they wanted to watch, let them watch. She had a door to build. Building the door took 6 days. One the lumber Hoffman had sold her was rough, saw marks still visible, edges uneven, surfaces splintered. But it was thick, 3 full inches, and it was dry. Dry wood would not shrink. Dry wood would hold its shape through the winter. She laid the pieces out on the ground beside the boiler and studied the opening she needed to seal. The firebox cut was not perfectly circular. The railroad salvage crew had used axes and cutting torches, leaving a ragged edge approximately 4 feet across at its widest point. The bottom of the opening sat 8 inches above the ground, where the boiler's curve met the earth. A rectangular door would leave gaps at the corners where the rectangle met the curve. She needed a door shape to match the opening, curved at the top and sides, flat at the bottom where it met the threshold. She had no template. Well, she had no pattern. She had a piece of charcoal in her own eyes. She crawled inside the boiler and pressed a piece of the lumber against the opening from within, marking where the wood met the iron. Then she crawled out and examined the marks. She adjusted. She remarked. She adjusted again. By the end of the first day, she had cut 2 pieces to rough shape the main body of the door, which would be made from 3 planks joined together, and a frame piece that would brace the assembly and hold the hinges. The crosscut saw was meant for 2 people. Using it alone meant awkward angles and exhausting labor. Each cut took 20 minutes of back and forth sawing, the teeth biting into dry oak, sawdust accumulating on the ground. Her arms burned. Her shoulders ached. The blisters on her hands, barely healed from clearing the boiler, tore open again. On the second day, she joined the 3 main planks using the bent nails from the blacksmith. The nails were poorly straightened, some curved, some kinked, and driving them required patience. She bent 3 nails before she learned the trick. Start each nail with light taps, letting it find its path, then drive it home with harder blows once it was set. The joined planks formed a rough rectangle, 3 inches thick and approximately 4 feet by 4 feet. She marked the curve she needed and began cutting. Cutting a curve with a crosscut saw was nearly impossible. The teeth were designed for straight lines. She made relief cuts instead, straight cuts from the edge toward the curve line, spaced every 2 inches, and then used the hammer to break away the waste wood between cuts. The result was ragged, splintered, ugly. When she smoothed the curve with the hand plane, shaving away splinters and high spots until the edge was even. The plane blade dulled quickly on the hard oak. She had no way to sharpen it. She worked more slowly, taking thinner shavings, preserving what edge remained. By the 4th day, the door's main body was shaped. It curved at the top to match the boiler's interior curve. The sides angled inward slightly, matching the cylinder's taper at the opening. The bottom was flat, meant to rest on a threshold she would build from additional scraps. The 5th day was hinges and threshold. The iron hinges were 6 inches long, meant for a barn door or a heavy gate. They were far larger than she needed, but they were what she had. She positioned them on the interior side of the door. The door would swing inward. So the hinges needed to be inside and mark the screw holes. She had no screws. She had nails. She drove nails through the hinge holes, angling them slightly so they would grip the wood rather than pull straight through. The first hinge took 11 nails. The second took 9. When she was done, the hinges were secure, but the door's interior surface bristled with nail points that would need to be bent flat. The threshold was simpler. 2 pieces of lumber, stacked and nailed, forming a sill 8 inches high at the bottom of the opening. She fitted it into place and secured it to the boiler's edge, using a mixture of clay and pine pitch, packed into the gap between wood and iron. The 6th day was fitting and sealing. She hung the door on its hinges and discovered the first problem. It didn't close. See, the curve she had cut was slightly too large at the top. A gap of nearly an inch showed at the peak when she pushed the door shut. She removed the door, planed away another quarter-inch along the top curve, and rehung it. Still too large, but now by only half an inch. She planed again, and again, and again. By midday, the door fit. It swung inward, cleared the threshold, and seated against the boiler's edge with a gap of perhaps an eighth of an inch all around, tight enough to seal, loose enough to open. The sealing took the rest of the day. She heated the pine pitch over a small fire until it flowed like thick honey, then applied it to every gap with a flat stick. She packed the pitch with strips of dried grass, pressing the fibers into the sticky resin until the gaps were filled. She applied a second layer of pitch over the grass, then a third. When she finished, the seal was ugly but solid, a ridge of black pitch and yellow grass circling the door's edge, filling every crack where wood met iron. She pressed her face to the gap and blew. No air moved. The door was done. But the door was only the beginning. The stovepipe challenge came next, and it was harder than she had expected. The valve hole at the boiler's rear was 4 inches in diameter. Standard stovepipe, the kind that would fit her mother's cook stove, was 5 inches. She needed to widen the hole by at least an inch all around. She had no drill. She had no cutting torch. She had a file that Martha Lindquist had included with the borrowed tools, a flat bastard file, 10 inches long, its teeth worn but still functional. Filing through 3/4 of an inch of iron was not a task measured in hours. It was measured in days. The rust helped. 6 years of exposure had weakened the metal around the valve hole, softening it slightly, making it more willing to give way under the file's teeth. But even rusted iron was still iron. The file bit shallow. Each stroke removed a thin curl of orange-red metal that accumulated on the ground like strange snow. She worked in 2-hour sessions, filing until her arm could no longer lift, then resting until the trembling stopped. The motion was awkward. She had to reach up and back, filing at an angle that strained her shoulder and elbow. By the end of the first day, she had widened the hole by perhaps a 1/4 inch on one side. At this rate, it would take 2 weeks to complete. She did not have 2 weeks. September was bleeding away. As the mornings were cooler now, she woke with dew on her blanket and saw her breath in the air before the sun rose. The first hard freeze could come any day. October 1st, October 5th, October 10th at the latest. She worked longer sessions, 3 hours, 4. Her arms stopped trembling and started going numb. Her grip on the file weakened. She dropped it twice, watched it tumble down the boiler's exterior curve, and land in the weeds. On the 4th day of filing, Orrin Halverson returned. He appeared at the rim of the ravine in the late afternoon, watching her work without announcing himself. She did not notice him until she stopped to rest and saw his silhouette against the gray sky. "Still alive," Halverson said. Sigrid set down the file. Her arm was shaking again. "Still alive." "Door's finished." "Yes." "Not bad work. Ugly. But solid. Your father teach you carpentry?" "He taught me enough." Halverson descended into the ravine. He walked past her to examine the door, running his hand along the pitch seal, pressing against the hinges. He grunted, approval or skepticism, she could not tell. Then he looked at the valve hole and the file lying on the ground. "You're widening it by hand," he said. "I don't have another way." "How long have you been at it?" 4 days. I've got maybe an inch done on one side." Halverson picked up the file and examined it. "This is a wood file. Teeth are too coarse for iron. You want a metal file, finer teeth, harder steel." "I don't have a metal file." "No, you wouldn't." He set the file down. "At this rate, you'll still be filing when the snow comes." "I know." And once the snow comes, you won't be able to work out here. Your hands will freeze to the iron. I know. Halverson looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, the weathered face of a man who had seen too much to show surprise at anything. The cold is coming, he said. I've seen enough winters to know. This one will be bad. The geese are flying early. The corn husks are thick. The signs are all there. This winter will be bad, and it will come early. Then I need to finish faster. You need to abandon this foolishness and find proper shelter. The Lindquist woman offered you her cellar. Take it. Mrs. Lindquist's offer expires at first snow. Then take it before first snow. Sigrid picked up the file. Her arm was still shaking, but she could not let him see weakness. Mr. Halverson, I appreciate your concern. I know you mean well. But I am not going to spend the winter in someone's root cellar, living on charity, waiting for spring to put me back where I started. I am going to finish this door, and I am going to survive the winter, and in the spring I am going to have something that is mine. You'll have a frozen corpse. That's what you'll have. Then I'll have that. But I'll have tried. Halverson shook his head slowly. Stubborn? Your father was the same way. It's what killed him. Going out in that cold to check on a cow. Too stubborn to admit the weather was turning. Stubbornness isn't strength, Miss Moen. Sometimes stubbornness is just a slower way to die. He turned and began climbing out of the ravine. Mr. Halverson, Sigrid called after him. He paused. Do you have a metal file? He stood there for a moment, not moving. Mind then, I'll bring one tomorrow. Halverson's file was smaller but sharper, a 6-inch metalworking file with fine teeth that bit into iron like a rat into cheese. He brought it the next morning without ceremony, handed it to her, and left without a word. The metal file changed everything. Where the wood file had removed thin curls, the metal file removed thick ribbons. Where each stroke had felt like scraping, each stroke now felt like cutting. By the end of the first day with the new file, she had widened the hole by another full inch. By the end of the second day, the hole was nearly 6 inches across, large enough for a standard stovepipe with room for a collar. She returned the file to Halverson the following morning, walking the 3 miles to his farm and back. He took the file without comment. He did not invite her inside. He did not wish her well, but he had given her the tool that made the difference. October arrived with frost on the ground and ice on the creek. Sigrid woke on October 1st to a world transformed. The scrub oaks in the ravine had turned yellow and brown overnight, their leaves brittle and falling. The grass was white with frost that did not melt until mid-morning. When she breathed, clouds formed in the air and hung there, slowly dissipating. The first hard freeze had come. She had the door. She had the widened valve hole. She had the cook stove positioned inside the boiler, its pipe rising through the hole and extending above the boiler's exterior curve. She did not have enough firewood. The mathematics had seemed manageable in August. The boiler was 1/3 the size of a proper cabin. It should need 1/3 the fuel, perhaps 2 cords for the winter instead of 6. She had estimated that she could scavenge 2 cords from deadfall and abandoned structures. She had been wrong. By October 1st, she had accumulated approximately half a cord. 20 hours of hauling, dragging, carrying, and half a cord. The problem was distance. The nearby deadfall was picked over, scavenged by other settlers who needed fuel as badly as she did. The abandoned homesteads she had counted on were farther than she remembered. 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles from Skull Gulch. Each trip took most of a day. Each trip yielded a few fence rails, a few collapsed boards, wood that was often rotted or green or both. Half a cord would last perhaps 6 weeks. Winter lasted 5 months. She needed more. She needed much more. And she was running out of time. The days compressed into a rhythm of desperate labor. She woke before dawn and walked. She walked east to the abandoned Thorson claim, where a sod house had collapsed 2 years ago, leaving behind a frame of cottonwood poles. She pulled the poles free from the rotting sod and dragged them back to the ravine, 2 poles per trip, each pole 8 feet long and 4 inches thick. The Thorson claim was 4 miles away. Each round trip took 5 hours. She walked south to the creek bottom where spring floods deposited driftwood against the banks. The driftwood was gray and light, dried by sun and wind, but it burned fast and gave little heat. She gathered what she could carry, an armload at a time, and added it to the pile. She walked north to the failed Erickson homestead, where a barn had burned 2 summers ago. The fire had charred the walls, but left the foundation timbers intact. She pried up the timbers with a length of iron scrap, the same piece she had used to scrape the boiler, and rolled them one by one down the ravine slope. Her hands cracked. The skin split along the creases of her palms, opening into fissures that bled when she gripped anything. She wrapped them in strips torn from her underskirt, but the wrappings came loose, soaked through with blood and sweat, and had to be replaced. Her weight continued to drop. She was eating once a day now, whatever she could scavenge. Late-season berries, bitter and sparse. The occasional rabbit caught in a snare she had made from wire. Roots dug from the creek bank, boiled in water until they were soft enough to chew. She was perhaps 100 pounds now, perhaps less. The cold made everything harder. Her fingers stiffened in the morning and did not limber until she had been working for an hour. Her joints ached with a bone-deep pain that did not fade. She coughed, and the cough did not go away. But she kept working. By October 15th, she had 1 cord. By October 20th, she had 1 1/4 cords. By October 25th, she had 1 1/2 cords. She needed 3. At least 3, probably more. And she was not going to reach 3 before winter locked the land in snow. The freight wagon overturned on October 27th. Sigrid heard the crash from the ravine, a distant splintering sound, followed by the screaming of horses. She climbed the slope and looked east toward the road that ran between Granite Falls and the settlements beyond. A wagon lay on its side, perhaps 2 miles away, 1 wheel still spinning. Logs had spilled from its bed and scattered across the road and into the ditch beyond. A man was trying to calm 2 panicked horses that had tangled themselves in their traces. She walked toward the wreck. By the time she arrived, the man had freed the horses and was standing beside the overturned wagon, staring at the mess. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a laborer. His face was flushed. From exertion or anger, she could not tell. He did not notice her approach until she spoke. "Are you hurt?" The man spun around. "What? No. No, I'm not hurt. The axle broke. The load shifted. The whole thing went over." He gestured at the scattered logs. 11 cords of firewood for Larson's store in Granite Falls. Now it's scattered from here to Kingdom Come." Sigrid looked at the logs. They were good wood, oak and ash, cut to length and split for burning. Professional cordwood, the kind that sold for $4 a cord in town. "The merchant will want them recovered," she said. "The merchant can go to hell. I told him the axle was weak. I told him the load was too heavy. He said make 2 trips then. But 2 trips means half the pay, and I've got a family to feed." The man kicked the broken axle. "Now I've got no wagon, no pay, and 11 cords of firewood sitting in a ditch." "Won't the merchant pay for the recovery?" The man laughed bitterly. "Larson? That old toad won't pay for anything he doesn't have to. He'll say the wood is damaged. The delivery failed. It's not his problem anymore. He'll probably charge me for the loss. Sigrid counted the logs scattered in the ditch. 11 of them had rolled down the slope and into a gully, too deep for easy recovery. The rest, perhaps 50 logs, lay scattered across the road and the grassy verge. "Those 11 in the gully," she said, "what will happen to them?" "They'll rot. No one's going to haul them out. It's a full day's work with ropes and a team, and for what? Firewood that's been sitting in water? It hasn't rained. The gully's dry. Doesn't matter. Larson won't pay for it, and I can't afford to spend a day hauling wood I won't get paid for." Sigrid looked at the logs in the gully. 11 logs, each perhaps 6 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, split and stacked. That would be close to a cord of dry season firewood. "I'll take them," she said. The man looked at her properly for the first time. He took in her thin frame, her cracked hands, her dress that had once been blue and was now something closer to gray. "You'll take them?" "I'll haul them out and take them away. You won't have to pay to recover them, and Larson won't have wood rotting on his delivery route." "Lady, those logs weigh 100 pounds each. More, some of them. How are you going to haul them anywhere?" "That's my problem. Do we have a deal?" The man shook his head slowly, not in refusal, but in disbelief. "You're serious. Do we have a deal? What's your name?" "Sigrid Moen." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "The Moen girl." The one living in the train boiler." So Eric's mockery had spread even to freight drivers. She kept her face neutral. "That's me." The man was silent for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Niels Bergman, Swedish, not Norwegian, but I hear you people don't mind that as much as you used to." She shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful, as if he was afraid of hurting her. "The logs are yours," Bergman said. "No charge, but I want something in return. I have 96 cents, that's all. Keep your money. If you make it through the winter in that boiler, I want you to tell people that Niels Bergman helped you. Tell them I'm a man who helps those in need. Can you do that?" Sigrid looked at him. His face was earnest, tired, frustrated, but earnest. He had just lost a day's wages and probably his wagon. But he was giving her a cord of firewood in exchange for a promise. "I can do that," she said. "If I survive, everyone in Yellow Medicine County will hear about Niels Bergman. Then we have a deal." Hauling the logs took 3 days. She could not lift them. She could barely move them. But she could roll them, pushing each log with her feet, her back, her entire body weight until it began to turn. The gully slope helped. She rolled the logs up and out of the gully, across the grass, down the ravine slope, and into the space beside the boiler. Each log took between 2 and 4 hours. The terrain was uneven. The logs snagged on rocks, caught on brush, wedged into depressions that required her to dig them free with her hands. She fell twice, and the second fall left a bruise on her hip that made walking painful for a week. On the second day, one of the logs rolled over her foot and pinned it against a rock. She felt the bones shift, not break, but come close. The bruise that formed was deep purple, fading to black, and 3 of her toes swelled so badly she could not fit her foot into her shoe. She finished with a bare foot wrapped in rags. But by October 30th, she had all 11 logs at the ravine. By November 2nd, she had split them into cordwood using a wedge she made from the iron scrap and a rock she used as a mallet. By November 5th, she had stacked them against the ravine wall, covered with brush to shed rain. 2.5 cords, not 3, not enough for the entire winter, but closer, much closer. The condensation problem revealed itself on the first night she fired the stove. It was November 8th. As the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees during the day, and would fall further after dark. She had been sleeping in the boiler without heat for a week now, wrapped in her blanket, curled against the cold. But tonight she would test the full system. She built a fire in the cook stove using small sticks and dried grass for kindling. The cracked firebox meant some smoke escaped into the boiler before reaching the stovepipe, but most of the draft pulled true. Within an hour, the interior had warmed noticeably. Then she saw the walls. The iron was sweating. Moisture beaded on the curved surface, condensing from the warm air onto the cold metal. As she watched, the beads grew larger, merged together, and began to run down the walls in thin rivulets that pooled on the floor. Within 2 hours, the floor was wet. The air was clammy. Her blanket was damp where it touched the metal. Martha Lindquist had warned her. Iron sweats in cold weather. She had thought she understood. She had not understood. The condensation would be manageable on a mild night like this. But in deep winter, with temperatures 40 or 50 below zero, the moisture would freeze on the walls. The interior would become an ice cave, dripping when she heated it, freezing when the fire died. She could not survive that. No one could. She needed a solution. She lay awake most of that night, listening to water drip, feeling the dampness seep into her blanket and her clothes and her skin. By dawn, her teeth were chattering despite the warmth of the stove. The solution came to her while she was hanging her blanket to dry on the brush pile. Burlap. Burlap was absorbent. Burlap was cheap. Cheap burlap could be found in any general store, used to wrap everything from flour to potatoes. But she had 96 cents. A single burlap sack cost 15 cents in Granite Falls. She would need at least a dozen sacks to line the lower walls where condensation was worst. She did not have the money, unless she did not buy the sacks at all. She walked to Granite Falls the next morning, arriving before noon. The general store, Larson's, owned by the same merchant who had stiffed Niels Bergman, had a pile of used burlap sacks behind the building, waiting to be burned. Sigrid approached the store clerk, a thin young man who looked at her ragged appearance with barely concealed distaste. "I'd like to buy those burlap sacks out back," she said. "The used ones." "Those aren't for sale. They're garbage." "Then I'll take them for free." The clerk frowned. "They're dirty. They smell like potatoes." "I don't mind." "What do you want them for?" "Does it matter?" The clerk considered this. Then he shrugged. "Take them. Mr. Larson won't care. Less for us to burn." She left Granite Falls with 17 burlap sacks rolled into a bundle on her back. The walk home took 4 hours. By the time she reached the ravine, the sun was setting and the temperature was falling. That night, she lined the lower walls of the boiler with overlapping burlap, hanging the sacks from nails driven into the rust-softened iron. The burlap covered the bottom 4 feet of the cylinder's interior, rising from the floor to just above her head when she sat. She fired the stove and waited. The condensation still formed. She could see moisture beading on the iron above the burlap line. But the burlap absorbed the moisture before it could drip. The sacks grew damp, then wet, but they held the water rather than letting it pool on the floor. In the morning, she removed the sacks and hung them outside to dry. The November air was cold enough that the moisture froze, then sublimated away, leaving the burlap stiff but dry. She rotated the sacks, dry ones in, wet ones out, and the system worked. It was labor-intensive. It was awkward, but it was a solution. November became December. The temperature dropped steadily, 20 degrees, 15, 10, 5 above zero, then below. On December 1st, the temperature reached 8 degrees below zero, the coldest night so far. Sigrid fired the stove heavily, was feeding it every 2 hours through the night. By dawn, she had burned through 1/8 of a cord, but the interior had stabilized at 41 degrees. 41 degrees was cold. She could see her breath. Her fingers ached when she removed her gloves, but 41 degrees was survivable. 41 degrees would not kill her. The iron walls worked exactly as she had hoped. They absorbed heat slowly during the day, warming to the touch over hours of steady fire. At night, they released that heat gradually, continuing to radiate warmth even when the fire burned low. The cylindrical shape distributed the heat evenly. No hot spots near the stove, no frozen corners far from the flame, and the wind could not touch her. She heard it every night now, the endless howl of prairie wind scraping across the land, driving snow, finding every gap in every structure. But inside the boiler, the sound was muffled. The iron blocked the wind completely. Not a whisper of moving air reached her. In a cabin, wind found the chinking. Wind penetrated the gaps between logs, the cracks around windows, the spaces where roof met wall. Even the best-built cabin leaked heat in a high wind. The boiler did not leak. The boiler was solid iron, forged to contain steam at pressure. Wind could scream against it all night and find no way in. Sigrid began to believe she might survive. Orrin Halverson came again on December 23rd. He brought a small ham wrapped in cloth, a Christmas gift, he said, though his expression made clear this was not a festive visit. He stood outside the boiler in the thin winter light and waited for her to crawl out to meet him. "You're alive," he said. "I am. The cold snapped last week. 8 below. How did you fare?" 41 degrees inside. I kept my coat on, but I was comfortable. Halverson's eyebrows rose. 41 degrees, with that cracked stove. The iron holds the heat. It absorbs it and releases it slowly. The wind can't get through. Sigrid gestured at the boiler. "Would you like to see inside?" Halverson shook his head. "I'll take your word for it." He handed her the ham. "You look thin." "I've looked thin since August. Thinner than that. Are you eating?" "When I can." Halverson was silent for a moment. Then, "We haven't had the real cold yet. 8 below is a warm night compared to what's coming. January is when people die. January and February." "I know. That iron, it's holding heat now, but wait until it's truly cold." "Well, 60 below. 70 below with wind. The metal will conduct the cold inward as fast as it conducts heat outward. Everything that's working now will reverse. You'll fire that stove until it glows, and the walls will still be stealing heat from the air." "You've said this before, Mr. Halverson." "I'm saying it again because you're still alive, and I'd like you to stay that way." He gestured at the ravine, at the boiler, at the world around them. "This is working now. It won't work forever. When the real cold comes, you'll need a backup plan. You'll need somewhere to go if the iron turns on you." "I don't have a backup plan." "Then get one. Talk to the Lindquist woman. Talk to someone. Don't let pride kill you when a single night in a warm cellar could save your life." Sigrid looked at the ham in her hands. No, it was heavy, 5 pounds at least, enough meat to last 2 weeks if she was careful. "Thank you for this," she said. "And thank you for the file. You didn't have to help me. I've buried one wife to the cold. I don't want to bury more people if I can help it." Halverson turned to go. Then he paused. "The geese flew south early this year. The corn husks are the thickest I've seen in a decade. My bones ache like they haven't ached since '73. Something bad is coming, Miss Moen. Something worse than anything we've seen in years. Whatever you think you know about winter, this one will be different." He climbed out of the ravine and disappeared. Sigrid stood holding the ham, watching the empty space where he had been. The sky was gray and low, thick with clouds that promised more snow. The wind cut through her coat like it wasn't there. Something bad is coming. She crawled back into the boiler and sealed the door behind her. January arrived with a false spring. The temperature rose. On January 2nd, it reached 22 degrees above zero, warm enough that snow melted from the south-facing slopes. On January 4th, it reached 29 degrees. On January 7th, it reached 34 degrees. Water dripped from tree branches. Ice cracked on the creek. The Norwegian farmers grew uneasy. Warm before cold means cold you can't imagine, Martha Lindquist told her husband. The word spread through the community. Other old-timers nodded and agreed. This unseasonable warmth was not a gift. It was a warning. On January 10th, the sky turned yellow. Sigrid crawled out of the boiler at mid-morning and looked up. The clouds had taken on a strange color, not white, not gray, but a sickly yellow-green that seemed to press down on the land. The air felt heavy. The wind had died completely, and the silence was profound. The birds were gone. She had not noticed them leaving, but they were gone now. No crows calling, no sparrows in the brush. Nothing. She thought of Halverson's words. Something bad is coming. On January 11th, the sky turned gray again, but the yellow tinge remained at the edges, lurking behind the clouds like something waiting. The cattle at the Lindquist farm refused to leave the barn. Dogs crawled under porches and would not come out. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the temperature was 30 degrees above zero. Children walked to school in light coats. Farmers worked in their fields without hats. The sun was bright through a thin haze of cloud. It was the warmest January day anyone could remember. Sigrid spent the morning gathering deadfall from the far end of the ravine. She had perhaps 2 cords of firewood remaining, enough for another month of normal cold, but not enough for the deep freeze the old-timers kept predicting. Every stick she added now was another hour of survival later. At noon, she returned to the boiler and ate a small meal, the last of Halverson's ham, boiled with some roots she had dug from the creek bank. She was tired. She had not slept well the night before. She decided to rest. She sealed the door, wrapped herself in her blanket, and closed her eyes. She dreamed of her mother, Ingrid Mohn, sitting by the window of the family cabin, staring at nothing. In the dream, her mother turned to look at her. "The iron will hold," Ingrid said. Sigrid woke to darkness and screaming wind. The sound was like nothing she had ever heard. It was not wind. Wind had a rhythm, gusts and lulls, rises and falls, the breath of a living thing. This was a continuous roar, a wall of noise that pressed against the boiler's iron walls with physical weight. The metal vibrated under her hands. The door shuddered in its frame. Sigrid sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding. She could see nothing. The interior of the boiler was absolute black. She felt for the stove, found it cold. She had let the fire die during her nap. The roar outside intensified. She heard something strike the boiler. Debris, she thought, branches or loose wood driven by the wind. Then another impact. Then another. She fumbled for matches. Her hands were shaking. The first match broke. So the second caught, flared, and showed her the interior of the boiler in flickering orange light. Everything looked normal. The door was sealed. The stovepipe rose through the valve hole, rattling slightly but intact. Her firewood was stacked against the curved wall. Her blanket lay where she had been sleeping. But the temperature had dropped. She could feel it now, the cold seeping through the iron walls, the air inside the boiler turning sharp and bitter. When she exhaled, her breath formed a thick cloud that hung in the air before slowly dissipating. The match burned down to her fingers. She dropped it and struck another. She needed fire. She needed it now. She opened the cook stove's firebox and found the coals from her morning fire, gray and dead. She crumpled dried grass into the box, added small sticks. She struck a third match. The grass caught. The sticks smoldered, then flamed. She added larger pieces, building the fire carefully, watching the flames grow. The warmth was immediate but small, a pocket of heat in the vast cold that was pressing inward from every direction. The iron walls were cold to the touch now, not just cool, as they had been on other cold nights, but cold, the kind of cold that bit into skin and made fingers ache. Outside, the roar continued, and beneath the roar, she heard something else, a high, thin whistling that rose and fell in pitch, climbing toward a scream before dropping away, then climbing again. The razor wind. She had heard old-timers speak of it, a wind so cold and so fast that it cut through clothing like a blade, froze exposed skin in seconds, killed men standing upright in their own fields. She had thought it was exaggeration, the kind of story people told to make ordinary winters sound dramatic. She was not exaggerating now. The first hour was the worst. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it falling, a physical sensation of heat draining from the air, from her body, from the iron walls around her. She fed the stove continuously, pushing wood into the firebox as fast as it would burn, watching flames leap and dance while the cold pressed inward. The iron walls began to work against her, just as Halverson had predicted. They had been warm from days of steady heating, but now they were surrendering that warmth to the killing cold outside. She touched the wall near her shoulder and felt the metal pulling heat from her palm. The interior temperature dropped. 50 degrees, 45, 40. She fed more wood. The stove glowed dull red at its seams. Smoke leaked from the cracked firebox, making her eyes water. The fire roared, consuming fuel at a rate that would empty her woodpile in days. But the temperature stabilized. 40 degrees. Then slowly, over the next hour, it began to climb. 42, 44, 47. The iron was absorbing heat again. The walls were warming. The thermal mass that had worried Halverson was doing exactly what she had hoped, taking heat from the stove, storing it, releasing it slowly back into the interior space. By midnight, the interior had reached 52 degrees. Outside, the wind still screamed. The temperature outside had dropped to 35 below zero and was still falling. But inside the boiler, wrapped in her blanket beside the glowing stove, Sigrid was warm. She was not comfortable, but the wind's howl was relentless, a sound that ground at the nerves and made sleep impossible. The smoke from the cracked firebox collected near the ceiling, making her cough. Her eyes burned. Her throat was raw, but she was warm. The stovepipe began vibrating at approximately 8 o'clock. She had been feeding the stove, pushing in another log when she heard it, a new sound beneath the wind's roar. A rhythmic humming, metal against metal coming from above. She looked up. The stovepipe rose through the valve hole at the boiler's rear end, extending 18 inches above the exterior surface. The wind had found it. The wind was striking the pipe directly, setting it vibrating like a tuning fork. As she watched, the vibration intensified. The pipe began to sway visibly, moving in small circles at its base. The tin reducer she had fashioned, the collar that connected the 5-inch stovepipe to the 6-inch valve hole, was working loose. She could see clay dust falling from the seal, tiny particles drifting down through the firelight like orange snow. If the seal failed, smoke would pour back into the boiler. The stove would not draw properly. Carbon monoxide would accumulate in the enclosed space. She would die in her sleep, poisoned by her own fire. Or she could let the fire go out and freeze. She grabbed a length of driftwood from her pile, a 3-foot section of cottonwood, thick as her arm, and wedged it between the stovepipe and the boiler's interior wall. The wood pressed against the pipe, forcing it back toward center, counteracting the wind's push. The vibration decreased, but did not stop. She added a second brace on the opposite side, creating a V of wood that held the pipe in place. The clay seal continued to shed dust, but more slowly now. The connection was holding. She sat back, breathing hard, and watched the pipe sway within its wooden cradle. The braces trembled with each gust. The wind outside screamed higher, then higher still, and the pipe strained against its supports like a living thing trying to escape. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the curved wall, watching the stovepipe, listening to the wind, waiting for the seal to fail. It did not fail. Dawn did not come. The sky at 7 in the morning was as dark as midnight, the sun blotted out by driving snow. Sigrid knew the time only because she had been counting hours since waking, marking each one by feeding the stove. See, the temperature outside had reached 42 degrees below zero. The wind had not slackened. Visibility was zero. She could not see the door from 2 feet away when she cracked it open to check conditions. She closed the door immediately, the cold biting into her face like a physical assault. Inside, the boiler held at 54 degrees. The iron walls had reached equilibrium, absorbing heat from the stove, releasing it into the interior, maintaining a steady temperature despite the killing cold outside. The system worked exactly as she had designed it. She thought about the mowing cabin 3 miles west. Eric and Lars would be in that cabin now, burning wood in the fireplace their father had built. The cabin was solid, chinked logs, good roof, thick walls. It had survived 7 winters without major repair, but the cabin had gaps. Every log cabin had gaps. The chinking between logs dried out and cracked. The door frame warped with seasonal changes. The roof met the walls at angles that were never quite tight. In normal cold, those gaps did not matter. A good fire overcame the small leaks, kept the interior warm, made the cabin livable. But this was not normal cold. This was 42 below zero with 60-mile-per-hour wind. This was the razor wind driving snow through every gap, finding every crack, stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. She wondered if her brothers were warm. She wondered if her brothers were alive. 3 miles west, Eric and Lars Moen were fighting for their lives. The blizzard had struck while they were in the barn, checking on the livestock. They had made it back to the cabin, 20 yards through wind that nearly knocked them off their feet. Snow so thick they could not see the door until they touched it and sealed themselves inside. The cabin was cold. The fire in the fireplace had burned low while they were out, and the cold had rushed in through every gap. They built the fire back up, feeding it logs, stoking it until the flames roared. The flames made no difference. The wind found the chinking. The dried mud and moss between logs had cracked during the warm spell, expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. Gaps had opened, some visible, most invisible, and now the razor wind poured through them. Snow accumulated inside the cabin walls. Thin lines of white appeared between logs, grew thicker, began to drift on the floor. Eric stuffed rags into the gaps. But the rags froze solid, and the wind blew through them anyway. By midnight, the interior temperature was 12 degrees above zero. The fireplace roared with a fire that consumed wood at triple the normal rate. The heat rose to the ceiling and vanished through the roof. The floor was frozen. Ice formed on the water bucket. Eric and Lars burned furniture. They burned the table their father had built. They burned the chairs their mother had sat in. They burned the spinning wheels she had brought from Norway, watching the carved wood blacken and twist in the flames. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees. Lars's feet went numb first. He removed his boots and found his toes white and waxy, the first stage of frostbite. He held them near the fire until feeling returned, a burning agony that made him cry out. Eric's hands stopped working properly. He could not grip the wood he was trying to feed to the fire. He had to push the logs with his forearms, shoving them into the flames like a man without fingers. By 2 in the morning, they had burned everything that would burn except the cabin's interior door. They looked at each other across the firelight, 2 brothers who had thrown their sister out with $4 and a cracked stove. "If we live," Eric said, his voice cracked and strange, "I'm going to find that iron coffin and apologize to Sigrid." Lars said nothing. His teeth were chattering too hard to speak. "If we live," Eric repeated. Outside, the wind screamed. 1 mile east of Skol Gulch, Henrik Dahlberg made a mistake. Dahlberg was 44 years old, a Norwegian farmer with 80 acres, a good cabin, and 30 years of winter experience. When the blizzard struck, he was inside with his wife Anna and their 3 children. The cabin was well stocked with firewood. The fire was burning strong. They were safe, but the livestock were not. Dahlberg had 12 cattle in the barn, including 2 milk cows and a pregnant heifer due to calve any day. The barn was 100 yards from the cabin, a distance he had walked 10,000 times in all weather. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with the blizzard at full force, Dahlberg decided to check on the heifer. His wife begged him not to go. The children clung to his legs. But he had been a farmer all his life, and farmers took care of their animals. A calf born during a blizzard, without help, would die. The heifer might die too. He put on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and opened the door. The wind hit him like a fist. He staggered, caught himself, and pushed forward into the white chaos. He could see nothing, not the barn, not the ground, not his own hands in front of his face. The snow drove horizontally, filling his eyes, coating his scarf with ice that cracked when he breathed. He walked forward. 10 steps, 20, 30. He should have reached the barn by now. He turned to look back at the cabin to orient himself by its light. He saw nothing. The cabin had vanished. Dahlberg was a calm man. He did not panic. He knew that disorientation in a whiteout was common, that the solution was to pick a direction and walk straight until you hit something. He chose a direction, the direction he believed led to the barn, and walked. He walked for 5 minutes, 10, 15. He hit nothing. The cold was working on him now. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. His face was a mask of ice. His lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. He turned 90 degrees and walked again. Still nothing. He turned again. Nothing. At some point, he would never know when, he began walking in circles. The tracks he left filled with snow within seconds, invisible, useless for navigation. He walked and walked and walked, and the cabin and the barn might have been 100 miles away for all he could tell. His legs stopped working first. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. The 3rd time, he fell. He tried to rise. His legs would not obey. The cold had reached his core now, slowing his blood, thickening his thoughts. He knew he was dying, but the knowledge felt distant, academic. Was like something happening to someone else. He lay in the snow, 20 feet from his own cabin door, and the blizzard buried him. Anna Dahlberg found her husband's body the next morning, frozen solid, his arm extended toward the cabin as if reaching for the door he could not see. Inside the boiler, Sigrid knew nothing of the Dahlbergs, nothing of her brothers. She knew only the wind and the cold, and the small circle of warmth that the iron walls held against the storm. She fed the stove. She watched the pipe. She waited. The blizzard continued through the night of January 12th and into the morning of January 13th. total duration. 18 hours of continuous assault. The wind did not slacken until nearly noon, and even then it died slowly, reluctantly, as if the storm resented giving up its grip on the land. When Sigrid finally opened the door, she stepped into a world transformed. The snow was 3 feet deep in drifts, 4 feet against the ravine walls. The sky was brilliant blue, scrubbed clean by the wind. The air was utterly still, so still that her breath hung in front of her face like a white flag. The temperature was 42 degrees below zero. She looked at the boiler behind her. Smoke rose from the stovepipe, thin and white against the blue sky. The iron walls were rimed with frost on the exterior, but when she touched them from inside, they were warm. She had survived. The realization hit her slowly, building from a whisper to a roar. She had survived the worst blizzard in living memory. The iron coffin had held. The skeptics had been wrong. She was alive. She stood in the snow, in air so cold it hurt to breathe. When she laughed, the sound was strange in the silent landscape, a human voice where no human voice should be. She laughed until tears ran down her face and froze on her cheeks, and then she laughed some more. She was alive. The full scope of the disaster emerged over the following days. 235 people had died in what came to be called the school children's blizzard, named for the many children who had been caught outside when the storm struck without warning. Some died walking home from school. Some died in fields where they had been working. Some died within sight of their own doors, blinded by snow, unable to find the way home. Henrik Dahlberg was among the dead. His widow Anna had found him 20 feet from the cabin, his frozen arm pointing towards safety he never reached. 3 of his fingers had to be broken to release his grip on a fence post he had grabbed in his final moments. The Moen brothers had survived barely. When neighbors reached the cabin on January 14th, they found Eric and Lars huddled against the fireplace stones, surrounded by the ashes of everything they had burned to stay alive. Both had frostbite. Lars would lose 2 toes on his left foot. Eric would spend 3 weeks unable to walk, his feet swollen to twice their normal size. Their cabin's interior had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn on January 13th. They had survived only because they burned the cabin's interior door and most of their stockpiled fence posts, feeding the fire through the night while the wind stole their heat faster than they could produce it. Word of Sigrid Moen's survival spread quickly. The woman in the iron coffin had stayed warm, while solid cabins nearly killed their occupants. She had maintained 54 degrees inside, warm enough to remove her coat, while 42 below wind screamed against iron walls that would not yield. She had used less fuel in 18 hours than her brothers had burned in 6. The news traveled through Yellow Medicine County like the storm itself, touching every farm, every settlement, every household that had struggled through the blizzard. The woman in the iron coffin had been right. Everyone else had been wrong. Orrin Halverson came on January 18th. He walked into the ravine slowly, his bad legs stiff in the cold, his breath forming clouds that drifted behind him like a white cape. He did not call out. He simply descended into the gulch and stood before the boiler, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. Sigrid heard his footsteps and emerged from the door, wrapping her coat around her shoulders. She had been expecting him. "Mr. Halverson," she said. Halverson did not respond immediately. He walked around the boiler, touching the iron, examining the stovepipe, looking at the door she had built. His face was unreadable. Finally, he spoke. 54 degrees. That's what I heard. Is it true? It's true. The whole time. 18 hours of blizzard, and you held 54 degrees. I never took my coat off because I didn't want to get comfortable, but I could have. Halverson was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, as if he were talking to himself as much as to her. I buried a wife to the cold. You know that. 1880? The hard winter. Her lungs filled with fluid, and she drowned in her own bed while I held her hand. He touched the boiler's iron wall. I thought I knew what cold does. I thought I understood it. 30 years of building cabins, of stacking firewood, of fighting winter every single year. I thought I knew. You knew what you had experienced, Sigrid said. That's not nothing. It's nothing compared to what you figured out. Halverson turned to face her. I told you this thing would freeze solid. I told you the iron would conduct cold inward as fast as it conducts heat outward. I told you that you'd die like a rat in a tin can. You did. I was wrong. The word seemed to cost him something. Pride, perhaps, or certainty. I've been building cabins wrong for 30 years. The iron held the heat in. The logs let it out. Everything I knew was wrong. Not everything. Your wife died because she was sick, not because your cabin was built wrong. The cold made it worse, but it wasn't the cold that killed her. Halverson shook his head. You're being kind. I don't deserve it. I came here twice to tell you to give up. I told you that you were being stubborn, that stubbornness was just a slower way to die. He looked at the boiler again. And here you are, alive, while half the county is counting their dead and nursing their frostbite. I was lucky, Sigrid said. The stovepipe almost failed. If the wind had shifted 10 degrees earlier, if the seal had given way, I'd have had to choose between carbon monoxide and opening the door. I don't know which I would have chosen. But you didn't have to choose. Is because you built it right. Halverson extended his hand, his left hand, the one missing 2 fingers. I came here to apologize and to ask if you'd show me how it works. The iron, the heat, the shape of the thing. I want to understand. Sigrid shook his hand. His grip was strong despite the missing fingers. I'll show you everything, she said. Come inside. Martha Lindquist came 2 days later. She brought bread, fresh bread, still warm from her oven, wrapped in a clean cloth. She descended into the ravine with the bread held before her like an offering, her face set in an expression that might have been embarrassment or might have been something else. Sigrid met her at the door. Mrs. Lindquist. Miss Moen. Martha held out the bread. My husband's mother used to say that fresh bread was the best apology. I don't know if that's true, but it's what I have. Sigrid took the bread. It was heavy and warm, the crust crackling slightly under her fingers. She had not eaten fresh bread since August. You don't owe me an apology, Sigrid said. You tried to help. The cellar was a genuine offer. The cellar was me saying you couldn't do it alone. I was wrong about that. Martha looked at the boiler, at the stovepipe rising from its rear end, at the door Sigrid had built with borrowed tools. I told you the iron would sweat. I told you the condensation would make it unlivable. It did sweat. I solved it with burlap. I know. Everyone knows. Everyone's talking about the burlap and the reduced space and the way the iron holds heat instead of letting it escape. Martha's voice carried something Sigrid had not heard before. Respect, perhaps, or wonder. You figured all of that out by yourself. No books, no training, no help except borrowed tools and a file from a man who told you to give up. I had help, Sigrid said. Mr. Bergman gave me firewood. You lent me tools. Mr. Halverson brought the file that let me finish the pipe hole in time. I couldn't have done it alone. But you did the thinking alone. You saw something in this rusted drum that no one else saw. That's not nothing. Sigrid broke off a piece of the bread and ate it. The taste was extraordinary, rich and yeasty and warm, nothing like the hard roots and stringy rabbit meat she had been surviving on. "Would you like to see inside?" she asked. Martha hesitated. Then, "Yes, I would." Sigrid led her through the door, showing her the interior space, the positioning of the stove, now the burlap lining the lower walls, the way the curved ceiling prevented heat from pooling at a peak. Martha listened, asked questions, touched the iron walls where they radiated gentle warmth from the morning's fire. "How hot did it stay during the blizzard?" 54 degrees at the warmest. It dropped to 48 when I let the fire burn low, but it never went below that. The iron holds the heat for hours, even without continuous fuel. And fuel consumption. I burned a quarter cord in 18 hours. That's heavy use. I was firing continuously through the worst of it. On a normal cold night, I burned perhaps an eighth of a cord, maybe less. A cabin would burn half a cord in that time. More, with wind like that. Martha shook her head slowly. "You're using a third of the fuel, in a space that's a third of the size. It's perfectly proportional. The size is part of it. But the real difference is the wind. The iron doesn't leak. Log chinking does." Martha nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking around the interior of the boiler. "I was trying to help," she said finally. "When I offered the cellar, I was trying to save your life. I know. But I was also saying you couldn't succeed. I was saying the smart choice was to give up, to accept dependence, to survive by surrendering." Martha met Sigrid's eyes. "My mother did that. Married a man she didn't love because he had a house and she had nothing. She survived, but she was never happy. I watched her grow old in someone else's home, living by someone else's rules, and I promised myself I would never do the same. But you did find someone to love, Mr. Lindquist." "I found someone. But I didn't have to. I had options. I had family, skills, a small inheritance from an aunt. If Arna had turned out to be cruel, I could have left. You didn't have options. Your brothers took everything. You had nothing except that broken stove and your own stubbornness. And this boiler. Martha smiled, an expression Sigrid had not seen on her face before. "You turned a piece of railroad garbage into a home. You survived a blizzard that killed 200 people. And you did it alone, after everyone told you it was impossible." "Not alone," Sigrid said again. "I had help. You had scraps. You had charity disguised as trade. You had a file from a man who thought you were going to die." Martha reached out and touched the iron wall. "Everything that mattered, you did yourself. That's not something to be modest about. Boy, that's something to be proud of." The community came over the following weeks. Farmers who had mocked Sigrid in September now walked into the ravine with hats in hands, asking questions. How thick were the walls? Where did the stovepipe exit? How did she deal with condensation? How much fuel did she burn? Sigrid answered everyone. She let them crawl inside the boiler, feel the warmth radiating from the walls, examine the burlap moisture system. She drew diagrams in the snow, crude sketches showing the principles of heat distribution in a cylindrical space, the importance of eliminating wind gaps, the relationship between interior volume and fuel requirements. She shared everything. 3 families acquired abandoned boilers from railroad salvage points within 50 miles. The salvage crews, surprised by the sudden demand, began charging fees that had never existed before. 2 farmers built what they called iron rooms, small additions to their cabins, lined with sheet metal on all interior surfaces. The iron rooms were not as effective as a full boiler. They had corners and seams, but they retained heat better than plain log walls. The Granite Falls General Store began stocking heavier gauge stovepipe, marketed as blizzard proof. The shopkeeper, a German named Voigt, had never sold stovepipe in January before. Now he could not keep it on his shelves. The method spread. The principles spread. Something had changed in Yellow Medicine County. Eric Moen did not come. Sigrid saw him once in early March in Granite Falls. She was buying salt with money she had earned selling 2 rabbit pelts. He was limping along the wooden sidewalk, was his feet still recovering from frostbite, his face pale and drawn. Their eyes met across the street. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Eric crossed toward her, his limp pronounced, his hands jammed into his coat pockets. "You survived," he said. "I did. The boiler worked." "It did." Eric was silent. His jaw worked as if he were chewing words he could not quite spit out. Finally, "You were lucky. The storm could have snapped your pipe and killed you with smoke. The seal could have failed. Anything could have gone wrong. Anything could have gone wrong in your cabin too, but I built something that held. You lived in something that leaked. That cabin was good enough for 7 winters. Father built it to last." "Father built it for normal winters. This wasn't a normal winter." Eric's face hardened. "You could have taken Gunnar Dahl. You didn't have to live in that thing. You made your own choice." "Yes, I chose the iron coffin." Sigrid felt something settle in her chest, not anger, not sadness, but something colder and more final. "And you chose to put me there, you and Lars. You knew what Father wanted. You knew the land was supposed to be mine equally, but you took it anyway because the law let you, and because I'm a woman, and because Gunnar Dahl offered you $40 for the introduction. That's not... Everyone in Yellow Medicine County knows now. They know you threw your sister out with $4 and a cracked stove. They know I survived in a train boiler while you burned your furniture to stay alive in the cabin you stole from me. They know what kind of man you are, Eric. They'll know forever." Eric stared at her. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. "I don't need your apology," Sigrid said. "I don't need anything from you. I just need you to understand that I won. I won and you lost, and there's nothing you can do about it." She walked away. She did not look back. Eric Moen never spoke to his sister again. He died in 1912 at the age of 53 of pneumonia, the same disease that had killed their father. His obituary in the Granite Falls paper did not mention Sigrid. Lars Moen came 2 weeks later, approaching the ravine on foot, alone. He descended the slope slowly, his gait uneven. He had lost the 2 toes on his left foot, and the wound was still healing. When he reached the bottom, he stood before the boiler and waited. Sigrid emerged from the door. "Lars," she said. Her younger brother looked older than his 26 years. The blizzard had aged him, deep lines around his eyes, a wariness in his posture that had not been there before. He held an envelope in his hands. "I came to give you something," he said. Sigrid waited. Lars extended the envelope. "It's $10. Your share of the spring egg money from last year. Mother saved it before she died. Eric and we kept it. We shouldn't have." Sigrid took the envelope, but did not open it. "Why now?" "Because I should have given it to you before. Because I should have spoken up when Eric told you to leave. Because I stood there and said nothing while my sister was thrown out of her own home." "You did." "I'm not going to make excuses. There are no excuses. I was a coward. I knew what Eric was doing was wrong, and I said nothing because it was easier, because the law was on his side, because I didn't want to fight him." "You're right, there are no excuses." Lars nodded. His eyes were wet. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve that. I wanted you to know that I knew that I always knew, and that I'm sorry." Sigrid looked at her younger brother, the boy who had carried her on his shoulders, who had brought her wildflowers when she was sick, who had grown into a man too weak to stand up for what was right. "I'm not going to forgive you," she said. "Not today. Maybe not ever. What you did, what you let happen, I can't pretend it didn't hurt." "I know. But I'll take the money, because it was Mother's and it should have been mine all along." Lars nodded again. He turned to go. Oz then paused. "The boiler," he said. "It's extraordinary. What you built. What you figured out. Father would have been proud. Father would have divided the land equally, the way he promised. He wouldn't have needed to be proud because I wouldn't have needed to build anything." Lars had no answer for that. He climbed out of the ravine and disappeared over the rim. Sigrid opened the envelope. $10 in paper currency, enough for 2 months of supplies or seeds for a garden or timber for improvements to the boiler. She put the money in her pocket and went back inside. By summer of 1888, at least 7 families in Yellow Medicine County had incorporated some version of Sigrid's principles into their homes. Solid metal construction in at least one room, reduced volume for heating efficiency, obsessive attention to draft elimination. The boiler had proved a concept, and the concept was spreading. The railroad, learning that their abandoned boilers had value, began charging salvage fees that had not existed before. 2 families pooled resources to transport a single boiler 30 miles to their combined property line, splitting the cost and the shelter. Sigrid never charged for her advice. When neighbors asked how the system worked, she told them. When they asked to examine the interior, she invited them inside. When they proposed improvements, she listened and experimented. "I survived because the iron was there when I needed it," she told Martha Lindquist one afternoon in May. "I didn't make the iron. I just used it. If it helps other people survive, that's worth more than any money." Sigrid Moen lived in the boiler for 4 years total through the winters of 1887 through 88, 88 through 89, 89 through 90, and 90 through 91. Each winter tested her. Each winter the iron held. In the spring of 1891, at the age of 27, she married Niels Bergman, the Swedish freighter who had given her 11 logs of cordwood without payment, asking only that she tell people he was a man who helped those in need. She kept that promise. Everyone in Yellow Medicine County knew the story of Niels Bergman and the overturned wagon. They homesteaded together in Swift County, 40 miles south. Sigrid designed their cabin with walls backed by sheet iron on the windward side, the north and west faces, moored where winter winds struck hardest. The cabin was snug in normal winters and comfortable in hard ones. They raised 3 children in that house, 2 daughters and a son. Sigrid Moen Bergman died in 1934 at the age of 70, in the same cabin she and Niels had built. Her obituary in the Benson Monitor mentioned her children, her church, her work with the local quilting society. It did not mention the boiler. But the people of Yellow Medicine County remembered. The story passed from parents to children, from old-timers to newcomers, changing slightly with each telling but preserving the essential truth. A woman had survived the deadliest blizzard in memory by living in a piece of railroad garbage that everyone said would kill her. The iron coffin, they called it. The name stuck. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 71 degrees in 12 hours. The razor wind struck the northern plains with a violence that had not been seen in living memory. Orrin Halverson had said she would die like a rat in a tin can. Eric Moen had called it her iron coffin. But Sigrid Moen did not die. She sat at 54 degrees in a coat she didn't need, listening to the wind scream against metal that would not yield. 235 people died in the school children's blizzard. Children froze within sight of their schoolhouses. Farmers froze within reach of their own doors. Families burned everything they owned and still could not stay warm. Sigrid Moen was not among the dead. The iron held.